We are the onions of the world. Hi! Today's project is a chair repair and replication, and I'm going to show you how I use template routing to replicate some unique chair legs. In like 2011, this chair from my mom's dining set broke. The back legs were ripped off the seat area, and it sat in this unusable condition for quite some time. So these highlighted parts are the parts on the chair that I replicated myself, and then the highlighted parts here are ones that I was able to salvage from the original chair. To complete this project, I used a bandsaw and a router table, and the star of this whole project is the flush trim router bit, which is a special type of bit with a bearing at the top, and it's used for template routing. So the bearing rides along any type of template, and it cuts the rest of your workpiece to match the template perfectly. Let's begin the construction! I could tell from the original broken piece that the wood used in this chair was cherry, and it was stained to this certain color. So I picked up some cherry boards, which were unfortunately only 1 inch thick. That was the only thickness of stock I could find, so I had to laminate the boards in order to achieve the desired 2-inch thickness of these fatty chair legs. Lamination is a type of glue up where you go face to face on pieces of wood. So you can see I'm smearing glue all over the face of each piece, and then I'm putting them together and clamping it as evenly as possible as I can. It's messy and annoying, but you know, sometimes you gotta do it if you can't access the materials you need. It's sad, but it's true. Then I used the old leg to create a template out of 1/4 inch MDF. I really like making templates out of this super thin MDF because it's really easy to run through the bandsaw, get all those weird curves that you might need, and sand to finish. And then after all the stock lamination was cured and fully dried, I traced the MDF template shape onto the thick cherry stock, and I cut that out at the bandsaw as closely as I could to the line, but ideally leaving an 1/8 inch overhang. So now the question, why don't you just trace the leg onto the cherry pieces, cut it out at the bandsaw as perfectly as you can, and then you have your leg shape cut out. You don't need to do all this weird template routing stuff. And here's my answer for you. My bandsaw is tiny and it lacks power. And cutting through 2-inch hardwood with my bandsaw is very difficult. And the bandsaw doesn't leave a great finish, especially if you're using a bargain brand like mine. See all those machine defects from the wiggling bandsaw blade? And that's because the bandsaw blade is incredibly thin and wobbles a lot during machinery. I'm not trying to leave that as the final finish on my leg cutout, especially because all those tiny little machine lines are so hard to sand out. The bandsaw's strength is its agility. The thin blade can easily take on any tight curves or wacky twists and turns, but it lacks the chunky weight of something like a table saw. That is, unless you're using like a $2,000 high-end bandsaw with a super thick blade in it.
We're going first class, up in the sky, with the beef loin, living the life.
The table saw has less agility, but you can count on it to leave a really good machine finish because of how immobile the blade is. So with your machines, you just have to know their strengths and weaknesses and apply them accordingly. And so after the bandsaw work is done and I've rough cut out the 4 legs, it's time to template route to a clean finish. So what I do is I use double-sided tape or even hot glue to secure the template to the workpiece, and I'm telling you, heed my warning. Try to get that workpiece as close to the template as possible without clipping in. So imagine an 1/8 of an inch. That's probably a good amount. I'm talking like the thickness of a commercial flour tortilla. That's how much overhang you want. The router table, it has a small appetite. It cannot eat a lot of wood. And if you try and feed too much wood into the router bit at once, it will just... But more on that later. So I set up my fat flush trim bit on my router table, and I raised the bearing so it was at the same height as the template. And then while using 2 very fat push sticks, I fed it in until everything was cleaned up to the size of the template. You'll see here, I'm feeding the workpiece in the opposite direction of the spin of the router bit. So the router bit spins this way, I'm feeding against it this way. Why do I do that? Well, because you need to provide some resistance to the router bit. If you feed your workpiece in the same rotation as the router bit, it's gonna grab that workpiece and it's gonna...
I'm like a bird and I'ma fly away. I'ma fly away.
Most router tables will have a direction of rotation on the top of the table, so you just kind of extend that arrow, make sure it's pointing at you, and then go the opposite way. And that's the thing, if you know me, you know I love the router so much, but router tables can be really tricky. When I'm doing routing operations in my shop, I almost always try to use the plunge base because it feels so much safer to me. Because with the plunge base, I'm gripping the router and I have my whole body weight over it and the workpiece is completely stationary. And I've really never had any weird issues with kickback that way. But the catch with using a plunge base is that you have to clamp or secure your piece somehow. And this can be kind of annoying, especially when you're working with weird shaped pieces. The clamps you use to secure it to your table are gonna get in the way of the router. So you either have to like double side tape it to the table or you need to like route a little bit, move the clamps, and that can be a bit tedious. The router table frees you of that because you switch things around. The piece is mobile, you're the one holding the piece, and then the router is completely stationary. But oh my gosh, it's so much scarier because instead of me being the wielder of the tool, I am instead a frightened weasel probing my barbecue tongs into this spinning blade. And that's why kickback on the router table can be pretty easy to get, at least in my opinion. If you're not holding your workpiece in a Zeus-like grip, it's so easy for that router bit to punch back up and at you. So all the disclaimers, what's the moral of the story? 1, pay attention that your feed direction is correct. 2, use hefty push blocks to keep your workpiece just completely glued to the table basically. And make sure that your push blocks are fairly close to the router table because the farther you have your hands away, the more leverage that router table has to kick back. It'll make kickback easier to happen. And then use a fence as a support when possible. So I did run into one slight error when I was doing all my routing, and that was on one of the back legs. And the thing about router tables that makes them so annoying is because sometimes you have to make a choice between grain direction and feed direction. On this piece right here, I was clearing up this one edge and I was going against the grain with the router bit. But I did this because I wanted my feed direction to be correct. And you'll see I got towards the end of the workpiece and I left a little bit too much overhang on there in combination with the grain direction. Totally knocked the top piece off. And luckily it wasn't that big of a deal because it came off in one perfectly clean chunk. So what I did is glue, clamp, we're good. Routed it again later, making sure I cleaned up the overhang a little bit better. So tragedies aside, after all the pieces were properly flush trimmed, I added some roundovers to match the original profiles on the chair. And then the rest of the construction was pretty basic, not super interesting. You know, I just used floating mortise and tenons to make the rest of the chair, you know, put the stretchers on the front and the back and the sides. And then the most complicated pieces in the chair, luckily, were salvageable, so I didn't have to try to recreate those because this would have been like a 3-hour video if I had to try to recreate that curved chair front and the center brace things. But yeah, so the chair was already looking super jazzy, and then I just did a bunch of stain matches to kind of try and match the original color of the chair, but this is the finished product. But yeah, I hope you learned something about template routing.